People say the cruelest part of growing old is the body giving up on you. The hands that tremble, the knees that refuse stairs, the eyes that blur the world into something softer and less certain. They're wrong. The body is honest. It tells you exactly what it's doing, exactly what it can no longer carry. The cruelest part of growing old is realizing the people you carried no longer see you at all. I learned that on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:17 p.m., standing just outside my own dining room, holding a tray with 2 cups of tea I had made for people who were already planning my absence. They didn't know I was there. That's the thing about being 91. You become quiet in ways you didn't intend, or footsteps soften, your presence fades, and eventually, people stop adjusting themselves when you enter a room. They don't lower their voices, they don't change the subject, they don't even look up. You become part of the furniture. David was sitting at the head of the table, my table, the one Harold and I bought in 1968 after saving for nearly a year. He had papers spread out in front of him, neat stacks, clipped and organized, the way he's always done things. Orderly, controlled, efficient. Helen sat across from him, her handbag still on her shoulder, like she wasn't planning to stay long. She never does. "I spoke to Prescott this morning," David said, tapping one of the papers. "He said we shouldn't wait too long. These things can get complicated if we leave them." Helen nodded, but her voice was softer. "She's still, you know." "Still what? Alive? Capable of hearing? Standing 10 feet away holding tea that was beginning to cool in my hands?" David exhaled the way people do when they're being patient about something inconvenient. "Helen, she's 91. We have to be realistic." Realistic. It's a strange word when applied to a person instead of a situation. "She wouldn't want this to become a mess," he continued. "The house, the accounts, the paperwork. It's better if we get ahead of it." "Ahead of what? My death?" Helen adjusted the strap of her bag. "I just don't want her to feel like we're rushing anything." David gave a small laugh. "Not cruel, not kind. Just practical. She won't know. We're just preparing." "She won't know." I stood there a moment longer than I should have. Long enough for the tea to tremble in the cups. Long enough for something inside me to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Then I turned around and walked back into the kitchen without making a sound. I set the tray down on the counter and stared at it as if it belonged to someone else. 2 cups, milk in one, no sugar in the other. I had made them exactly the way they liked, the way I always have. Habit is a stubborn thing. It survives long after love begins to change shape. I didn't cry. Not then. Crying requires a kind of surprise, and if I'm being honest, there was none. Not really. There had been signs, small ones, easy to ignore if you're busy remembering your children as they were, instead of seeing them as they are. David checking the value of homes in my neighborhood, out of curiosity. Helen asking, a little too casually, if I'd updated anything recently. Paul had said nothing. And sometimes silence carries more weight than words. I walked to the sink and looked out the window. The same window I've stood at for decades. The oak tree in the yard is taller now, its branches stretching further than Harold ever thought they would. He used to say he'd trim it back one summer. He never got that summer. Funny how life works like that. You think there's time. You assume there will be another season, another chance, another conversation. Until someone else starts planning the moment you won't be there. I dried my hands on a towel that has seen better days and sat down at the kitchen table. Not the dining room table. That one felt occupied now in a way it never had before. This table was smaller, older, ours in a quieter sense. There's a drawer on the right side. It sticks a little when you pull it, always has. Harold said he'd fix it. He fixed everything else. I opened it and took out the notebook. Green cover, spiral binding, worn edges. His handwriting filled every page. Groceries, repairs, birthdays, bills. A life accounted for in careful, deliberate lines. I ran my fingers over the ink as if it might still be warm. "We did all right," I said out loud, though there was no one there to hear it. And we built something steady, something honest, Not extravagant, not impressive to strangers, but ours. And now it was being measured, evaluated, prepared, reduced. Not maliciously. That's the part people misunderstand. It wasn't cruelty in the way stories like to paint it. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no declarations of greed, just quiet calculation, which in its own way is worse. Because you can argue with anger. You can defend yourself against cruelty. But how do you confront practicality? I sat there for a long time, long enough for their voices in the other room to fade into something indistinct, long enough for the house to feel like it was holding its breath. And then, very gently, a thought came to me. Not sharp, not sudden, steady. What if I didn't let them? What if the story they were quietly writing about my ending wasn't the one that actually happened? I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I wasn't thinking about what my children needed. I was thinking about what I wanted. And that, at 91 years old, is a dangerous thing to discover. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I locked my bedroom door. Not because I was afraid of them. No, fear had never been the problem. It was something quieter than fear, something that had lived in me for decades without ever being questioned. A habit of access, of leaving doors open, of being available, always. Motherhood teaches you that. You learn to exist without barriers, without privacy, without asking whether anyone has earned the right to your time, your energy, your life. And then one day, you're 91 years old, and you realize no one ever gave those things back. The click of the lock was soft, almost polite. But it echoed in my chest like something much louder. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. Harold's side was still untouched. 6 years, and I had not moved his pillow. Not because I believed he was coming back, but because moving it felt like agreeing that he wouldn't. Grief is a negotiation you never quite finish. I lay down, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. There's a crack above the window, thin and branching, like a river seen from far away. I've watched it grow over the years, slow and quiet, the way most changes happen. Nothing breaks all at once. That's the lie people tell themselves. The truth is, things fall apart in pieces so small you can ignore them, until suddenly you can't. David's voice from earlier returned to me. We have to be realistic. I repeated it in my head, testing the weight of it. Realistic would have been admitting that I was still here. Realistic would have been asking me what I wanted. Realistic would have been remembering that this house wasn't just an asset. It was a life. But realism, it seems, is often just a convenient name for other people's plans. I turned onto my side, facing Harold's pillow. Can you believe this? I asked quietly. I used to talk to him all the time after he passed. Out loud, full conversations, updates about the day, complaints about the neighbors, questions I already knew he wouldn't answer. Lately I had stopped, not because I had less to say, because it felt like I was the only one still listening. But tonight was different. They're preparing, I said, like I'm already gone. The room, of course, said nothing back, but something in me did. A memory. Harold at the kitchen table, that same green notebook open in front of him, pencil in hand. Cecily, he had said once, not looking up. You always think too far ahead. And you don't think far enough, I replied. He smiled at that. That's why we worked. We worked because we balanced each other. Because where he was careful, I was hopeful. Where I gave, he protected. And now without him, I had continued giving. Long past the point of balance. I sat up. There's a moment, small, almost invisible, when a decision begins. Not when it's made, that comes later, but when it first takes root. This was that moment. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. Slowly, my knees protested, as they always do, but I ignored them. The body complains, the mind decides. I walked to the dresser and opened the top drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of neatly folded sweaters, was an envelope. Plain, white, unremarkable. Inside it was a copy of my will, the one Harold and I had signed together. Equal division, clean, fair, expected. It had made sense then, back when family meant something simpler. I held the envelope in my hands and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Clarity. There's a difference. Anger is loud. It burns quickly, consumes everything in its path. Clarity is quiet. It settles. It stays. And once it arrives, it's very difficult to ignore. I sat back down on the bed and opened the envelope. The paper inside was crisp, the ink still sharp. Legal language, precise and detached. No mention of dinners cooked, or nights stayed awake, or years given without question. Just assets, distribution, finality. Then again, and with each line the same thought returned, this is not the ending I choose. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back inside. For a long time, I had believed that fairness was the same as love. That if I divided everything evenly, I was honoring what Harold and I had built. But fairness, I realized, does not account for presence. It does not measure care. It does not see who showed up and who stayed away. It simply divides, and I was no longer interested in being divided. I stood again, slower this time, and walked to the door. My hand rested on the lock. For a moment I considered unlocking it, returning to the version of myself they expected, the one who didn't question, the one who waited. It would have been easier, comfortable even, but comfort, I've learned, is often just another word for surrender. I turned the lock again, just to hear it. A small sound, a final one. No, I said, though no one had asked. The word felt unfamiliar in my mouth, but it also felt right. The next morning I woke earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, because for the first time in a long while, I had something to do. I dressed carefully, not my everyday clothes, but something better, a blouse I had been saving for no particular reason. Funny how often we save things for later, as if later is guaranteed. I brushed my hair, applied a touch of lipstick, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was older than I felt, but her eyes were sharper, more awake. About time. In the kitchen, the house was quiet. David and Helen had left the night before. I hadn't said goodbye. There didn't seem to be a point. I made myself a cup of tea, just one, and I didn't rush. That was new too. After breakfast, I walked to the phone. It sat on the counter exactly where it always had. Familiar. Reliable. I picked it up and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It rang twice, then 3 times. On the 4th, a voice answered. Margaret speaking. I smiled before I even realized I was doing it. Margaret, I said, I need a lawyer. There was a pause, not a surprised one, an understanding one. Well, she replied, it's about time. Margaret did not ask questions. That's one of the reasons we had remained friends for over 50 years. She understood that when a person finally decides to act, questions are often just another way of slowing them down. Come by at 10, she said, and wear something that makes you feel expensive. I almost laughed. Margaret, I'm 91. And, she replied, you think dignity has an expiration date? No, I said. Good. Then I'll see you at 10. She hung up before I could respond, which is also very much like her. At 9:15, I was already ready. I chose a navy coat I hadn't worn in years and a pair of shoes that were slightly impractical but made me stand a little straighter. It's strange how clothing can remind you of who you used to be, and who you still are if you decide not to forget. The drive to Margaret's house felt different. Familiar streets, the same turns I've made for decades, but something about them seemed sharper, more defined, as if the world had been waiting for me to pay attention again. Margaret opened the door before I could knock. She looked exactly the same. Older, yes, but unchanged in the ways that matter. Sharp eyes, steady posture, the kind of presence that makes people reconsider what they were about to say. Took you long enough, she said, stepping aside. I had things to do, I replied. For 30 years? For a lifetime, I said. She nodded once. No judgment, just acknowledgement. Her kitchen smelled like overbrewed coffee and something slightly burnt. Some things never change. Sit, she said, already reaching for 2 cups. I sat. She poured without asking. I took a sip and immediately regretted it. Still terrible, I said. And yet you keep coming back, she replied. Habit, I said. Exactly, she said, looking at me more closely now. Now tell me what finally broke. I considered the question. Nothing broke, I said slowly. That's the problem. Everything just shifted, quietly. She waited. They're preparing, I added. My children, papers, lawyers, timelines. Margaret's expression didn't change. Of course they are, she said. The words landed harder than I expected. You knew, I asked. I didn't need to know, she replied. I've seen it before. I looked down at my hands. They didn't even lower their voices, I said. I was in the next room. Margaret leaned back in her chair. That's when it happens, she said. Not when they start thinking about it, when they stop hiding it. I nodded. There it was. Not the act itself, the indifference to being seen. I don't want to be managed, I said, or scheduled, or reduced to paperwork. Then don't be, Margaret said simply. I looked up at her. It's not that easy. It's just uncomfortable. There's a difference. Comfort, I was beginning to understand, had cost me more than I realized. What do you want? She asked. The question sat between us. Simple, direct, and surprisingly difficult. For years my answers had always included someone else. What do the children need? What would Harold prefer? What's expected? Now, for the first time, the question stood alone. What do you want? I started, then stopped. Margaret didn't rush me. I want to stop feeling like I'm waiting, I said finally. For what? For permission, I said. She smiled. There it is. I exhaled. I also want a lawyer, I added. That part's easier, she said, standing. Get your coat. We drove across town to a building I had passed 100 times and never entered. Inside, everything was clean, quiet, efficient, the kind of place where decisions are made and recorded and rarely undone. Margaret spoke to the receptionist with the confidence of someone who expects to be listened to. We're here to see Patricia Lyndon Young, she said. The name meant nothing to me, but it would. A few minutes later, we were shown into an office. Patricia was younger than I expected, mid-40s perhaps, composed, observant, the kind of person who notices what isn't said as much as what is. Mrs. Marrow, she said, extending her hand. Please, sit. I did. Margaret remained standing for a moment, then took a seat beside me. How can I help you? Patricia asked. I looked at her, really looked, and for the first time since that Tuesday afternoon, I spoke without hesitation. My children are waiting for me to die, I said. No softening, no politeness, just the truth. Patricia didn't flinch. That happens more often than people admit, she said. I don't want to be part of that process, I continued. I want to change what happens next. She nodded. Then we can do that, she said. Just like that. No resistance, no doubt. Choice. Real, immediate, available choice. Tell me what you'd like, she said, sliding a notepad closer. And so I did, not all at once, but steadily. The house, the accounts, the structure, who gets what, and more importantly, who doesn't. As I spoke, something shifted again. But this time, it wasn't quiet. It was grounding. Each decision felt like placing a stone beneath my feet, building something solid where there had only been assumption before. Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to. When I finished, Patricia reviewed her notes. We can revise everything, she said, but I want to be clear. This may upset your children. I almost smiled. They're already upset, I said. They're just used to me accommodating it. Patricia nodded. Then we proceed carefully, she said. Carefully, not cautiously. There's a difference. Careful means intentional. Cautious means afraid. I was done being afraid of discomfort. We scheduled another meeting. There would be paperwork, signatures, formalities, but the decision, that was already made. When we left the office, the air outside felt different. Or maybe I did. Margaret glanced at me as we walked to the car. Well, she asked. I took a breath, deep, Steady. I'm not finished yet, I said. She smiled. I know, she replied. The changes did not happen all at once. That's another lie people believe, that transformation arrives like a storm, loud and undeniable. In truth, it's quieter than that. It settles into your life in small decisions, repeated daily, until one morning you wake up and realize you are no longer who you were pretending to be. The will was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice things I had ignored for years, not just in my children, but in myself. How often I apologized for taking up space. How quickly I dismissed my own desires. How naturally I placed everyone else at the center of decisions that belonged to me. It wasn't something they had taken. It was something I had handed over. That realization was not painful. It was freeing, because anything given can be reclaimed. I started with small things. I stopped answering the phone immediately, not out of spite, but out of choice. When David called, I let it ring. Then I called back later, when I felt like speaking. The first time I did it, my heart raced as if I had done something wrong. By the third time, it felt normal. By the fifth, it felt necessary. Helen left a message one afternoon. Mom, we need to talk about some practical things. There was that word again. Practical. I listened to the message twice, then deleted it. Not because I didn't understand it, because I did, and I no longer agreed. Instead of calling her back, I went out. Just a short walk at first, then longer ones, then places. I visited the library where I had worked for 22 years. The same quiet building, the same scent of paper, and dust, and time. They had replaced the front desk, updated the computers, but the feeling remained. Familiar, enduring. I spoke to the director about making a donation, not a symbolic one, a meaningful one. For the children, I said, and for the heat. It was always cold in the winter. She smiled. We could use both, she said. We named the reading room after Harold. I stood there the day they placed the plaque on the wall, watching his name settle into something permanent. Not a memory, a presence. This is right, I whispered. And for the first time in years, I felt certain. I traveled again, too. Not far, but far enough. A bus ride to a town I had never visited. A small restaurant where no one knew my name. A park bench where I sat for an hour doing absolutely nothing. It turns out doing nothing is a luxury when your life has been spent doing everything for everyone else. The calls from David became less frequent, then sharper. Mom, what are you doing? He asked during one conversation. Living, I replied. That's not what I mean. I know, I said. There was a pause. You're making things complicated, he added. No, I said calmly. I'm making them mine. He didn't like that. But then again, this was never about what he liked. Helen stopped calling altogether for a while. Silence can be a strategy, but it can also be an answer. Paul called one evening, unexpected. Mom, he said, his voice softer than the others. I heard you've been busy. I have, I said. There was a pause. Good, he replied. Just that. No questions about money, no careful wording. Just good. We spoke for a while about nothing important, which I've learned is often the most important kind of conversation. When we hung up, I realized something. Not all distance is loss. Some of it is clarity. The final decision came on a quiet afternoon. I was sitting in the living room, the piano beside me. Yes, I bought one. Dark wood, slightly out of tune, perfect. I pressed a single key and let the sound linger. I thought about my mother, about promises never kept, about time. There's never as much of it as you think, but there's often more than you use. I called Patricia the next day. I'm ready, I said. The paperwork was finalized, signed, witnessed, complete. The house would not be sold, not by them, not after I was gone. It would go to someone who understood what it meant to stay. The rest, distributed with intention, not fairness, not expectation, truth. When David found out, he was furious. Mom, this isn't right, he said. It is, I replied. You're punishing us. I'm correcting something. Helen sent a letter, carefully worded. disappointed, confused, concerned. I read it once, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. Not every message requires a response. Paul called again. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. I closed my eyes. "Thank you," I replied. That meant more than everything else combined. Life did not become perfect. That's not how this works. There were still quiet evenings, still moments where the house felt too large, still memories that arrived uninvited and stayed longer than I wanted. But there was something new alongside them. Ownership. Not of things, of myself. And that changes everything. I am 91 years old. My hands are not steady. My steps are slower. My reflection is not the one I remember. But I am still here. Still choosing. Still deciding what my life looks like. They thought they were waiting for an ending. What they didn't understand is that I was still writing it. And I am not finished.